All right, welcome back. We're going to look at Learning Objective 3, discussing the significance of Jefferson and Madison's presidencies and show how they helped lead to the downfall of the Federalist Party and led to the development of the era of good feeling. So part of the significance of both Thomas Jefferson and James Madison as presidents lie in their pragmatism in adjusting their political philosophy to the needs of the country. Both of them were able to see the need to change from having a strict interpretation of the Constitution to having a loose interpretation of the Constitution to meet the country's domestic and foreign needs, as can be demonstrated through Jefferson's Louisiana Purchase of 1803, his Embargo Act of 1807, and his attempt to win the respect for the right on the high seas with the war in Tripoli in 1808. So from the previous unit, we're very familiar with the Louisiana Purchase of 1803. He was able, since there was so much land to gain, and this fit the vision of his yeoman farmer republic, as agrarian republic, in which he thought Americans, in order to have a viable democracy, would have adequate enough land in order to be independent. He switched from having a strict interpretation of the Constitution to a loose. We're going to watch a couple of videos here looking at the Tripoli War of 1801 to 1805 and then the Embargo Act of 1807 to get further details on those two events.
Pirates stalked the seas again, seizing ships and holding cargoes and crews hostage. Strange as it seems, the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps were forged over 2 centuries ago to fight pirates. For hundreds of years, the Barbary pirates, or corsairs, terrorized the Mediterranean Sea. They sailed from ports along the North African coast, taking their name from the Barbary states of Tripoli, Tunis, Algiers, and Morocco. The Muslim pirates sided with the Ottoman Turks against Christian Europe. They preyed on merchant vessels, attacking ships and imprisoning their crews. If no one ransomed captive sailors, the corsairs enslaved them at hard labor. Barbary pirates raided as far away as England and Iceland, kidnapping villagers to sell in African and Ottoman slave markets. Sometimes European governments fought the pirates. More often, they paid them bribes, called tribute, to leave their ships alone. But across the Atlantic, a new nation was forming that would challenge the Barbary corsairs. After Americans threw off British rule, the merchant ships no longer had Royal Navy protection. The corsairs began to prey on American vessels bound for Mediterranean ports. For the new nation to survive, its goods had to reach market. The U.S. had to protect its commercial fleet. Fresh from British occupation, Americans distrusted the idea of a national military. Many of the founding fathers wanted a navy only strong enough to protect American shores. With few warships, the U.S. simply couldn't fight the pirates. In 1784, Congress agreed to spend $80,000 to bribe the Barbary corsairs. To make the deal, Thomas Jefferson and John Adams sailed to England. In London, the envoys asked Tripoli's ambassador what gave the Barbary states the right to seize American ships and crews. It was the duty of all believers to make war against the unbelievers, the ambassador replied. Any Muslim slain in battle was sure to go to paradise. But he promised them that payments to Tripoli would guarantee safe passage. So America, too, paid tribute. The corsairs released American captives and agreed to let American ships be. But the attacks continued. As Americans began to lose patience, their leaders debated what to do. Jefferson argued for a stronger navy. It will be more easy to raise ships and men to fight these pirates and to reason, he wrote, than money to bribe them. John Adams disagreed. We ought not fight them at all, he said, unless we determine to fight them forever. America resisted a military buildup until bribes to the pirates grew to almost 20% of the national budget. And still American sailors suffered in Barbary prisons. The country's outlook hardened. Congress decided America needed a force that could defend its trade on the world's oceans. In 1794, President George Washington authorized construction of 6 frigates, long-range attack vessels, fast and well-armed. Each would carry U.S. Marines, a force modeled on British troops stationed aboard warships. Now America would have a fighting navy. In 1801, Jefferson became president. Tripoli immediately tested him. Its ruler, Pasha Yusuf Karamanli, demanded more tribute. When Jefferson refused, the Pasha declared war. Only Congress could send Americans into combat. But on his own, President Jefferson ordered U.S. warships to the Mediterranean. After the frigate sailed, he revealed what he'd done. The style of the demand admitted but one answer, Jefferson told Congress. I sent a small squadron of frigates into the Mediterranean. At first, the U.S. Navy fared badly. Corsairs took the USS Philadelphia, imprisoning her crew and sailing the captured frigate to Tripoli. At home, critics savaged Jefferson's foreign adventure. He stayed the course. A turning point came in 1804. In a night raid led by Lieutenant Stephen Decatur, Navy commandos blew up Philadelphia. U.S. warships bombarded Tripoli, wrecking her fortifications. Still, Karamanli refused to release his American captives. After a year of fruitless negotiation, the U.S. took action again. William Eaton, American consul to Tunis, assembled a small force of Marines and mercenaries. In April 1805, Eaton marched his troops from Egypt across 500 miles of desert to catch the Pasha by surprise. The Marines recruited the Pasha's enemies, including his brother, then invaded Tripoli. To stay in power, Pasha Yusuf signed a treaty releasing American hostages and promising to end attacks on American ships. The hard line seemed to work. Jefferson told Congress, the states on the Barbary Coast seem generally disposed at present to respect our peace and friendship. But the corsairs had not ended their attacks. And in 1815, Commodore Stephen Decatur led American fighting men to victory in a second war against the Barbary pirates. This time, the raids stopped for good. The pirate kingdoms were beaten, and a new maritime power had emerged. President James Madison declared, as peace is better than war, war is better than tribute. The United States, while they wish for war with no nation, will buy peace with time. Today's pirates terrorize the seas as the Barbary corsairs did long ago. With modern weapons and speedboats, they take prizes as large as oil tankers, demanding millions to ransom cargo and crews. Somali outlaws have made the seas off the Horn of Africa the most dangerous in the world, waters through which 30% of the world's oil must pass to reach market. To stop the attacks, a coalition that includes the United States has formed an international task force to patrol the area. And 2 centuries after American sailors and Marines first made their name fighting the Barbary corsairs, they face a new generation of pirates on the high seas. strange as it sounds.
So a very interesting early conflict in early American military history here. The Tripolitanian War of 1801 through 1805. And if you didn't catch the significance of how Jefferson is being pragmatic here and therefore extending the power of the federal government through executive action, sending those frigates there without consulting Congress. It really is going to set precedent for future conflicts and that America gets involved in, and really demonstrating Jefferson to be a pragmatist in many ways here. He does not want to risk this conflict being mired in congressional debate. And so he sends them out there and he goes to Congress and says, they're there already. Do you guys want to fund them? And at that point, Congress really has no choice but to fund them, because if they don't, then they're just left out there on their own, and Congress will get the blame for that. So very interesting how Jefferson is changing his tune once he becomes executive here, and adopting really a Federalist attitude when it comes to executive power. This is something that Hamilton might have advocated. And so we'll see this one by one, the Democratic Republicans taking Federalist ideas and therefore marginalizing the Federalist as a political party, because if you have the Democratic Republicans using Federalist ideas, then why would we eventually need the Federalist Party? So now let's take a look at the Embargo Act of 1807.
Meanwhile, the Napoleonic Wars begin to interfere with America's expanding shipping industry.
It was a lose-lose situation, how to negotiate in troubled waters in the Napoleonic Wars. It's important to keep in mind that the Jeffersonians, as much as the Federalists, were determined to maintain neutrality. So the dilemma for Jefferson is that belligerent talk and the effort to vindicate neutral rights went for him hand in hand with a failure to prepare.
In the interim, what Jefferson sought to do was to impose an embargo. And that put the Customs Service in a very difficult position because, of course, they saw themselves as developing and articulating what this commercial republic was and how it ought to develop further and prosper. And yet here was Thomas Jefferson saying we had to put essentially restrictions on that by imposing an embargo.
The embargo triggers a serious economic depression. Hardest hit are the merchants and shipowners of the Northeast, most of them Federalists.
It's one of the great tragic set pieces of American political history. It led Jefferson into wholesale invasions of civil rights and liberties, trying to keep Americans from trading abroad. It was logistically impossible and required the use of federal power in the court systems in a way that was effectively nullified throughout much of New England. In fact, Jefferson's reverence or respect for local self-government was reinforced by New England's resistance to his embargo. But of course, the ultimate disaster was that that war came nonetheless, and it was called Mr. Madison's War, but it was really Mr. Jefferson's war.
So to recap what happened there, basically, just to break it down, you have France and Great Britain having conflict. They're both cutting off each other with trade. The United States depends on European trade for its economy, and so they're trying to still trade while France and Great Britain are fighting. And what's happening is that American merchant ships are getting basically caught in the crossfire. Some of the ships are being, the cargo is being seized, and some of the British Navy fleets are impressing, which is basically kidnapping American merchants who are engaged in trade and bringing them into the Royal British Navy. And so there is a danger that the United States is going to go to war with Great Britain. The United States at this point is not in a situation, is not in a position to go to war with Great Britain. And Jefferson wants to avoid that with all cost. Philosophically, he wants to avoid a great war like that because he understands war gives governments more power, and so he wants to avoid it in that case. And so what Jefferson is going to do is he's going to get Congress to pass the Embargo Act. So let's just take a look at how this affects his interpretation of the Constitution. Being pragmatic, right? Do we want to go to war with Great Britain, or do we want to find other means? And so here's what he uses with the Constitution to justify the Embargo Act. Article 1, Section 8, which gives Congress the ability to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states. So the key word here is to regulate commerce. However, it doesn't say anything about cutting off commerce. Jefferson's going to interpret Article 1, Section 8 to mean that the federal government does have the ability to cut off trade with foreign countries. And so he's going to use this as leverage against Great Britain to hopefully get Great Britain to change its mind about how it deals with violating America's neutral rights, which is basically to be able to trade as if nothing's going on in Europe at this point. It's ultimately not going to work. This is ultimately going to lead to the War of 1812 when Madison is president. But that's another matter here. But again, what Jefferson is doing is he's loosening up his interpretation of the Constitution and trying to find some wiggle room within his interpretation of the Constitution in order to avoid what he finds the greater evil of a war with Great Britain. So when Madison becomes president, as leader of the Democratic-Republican Party, he continues to narrow the gap between the two parties by approving two of the Hamilton's economic proposals from the 1790s. In 1816, the Democratic-Republicans created the Second Bank of the United States, and they passed a protective tariff that Hamilton had recommended in his report on manufacturers in 1791. Thus, by 1816, the Democratic Republicans were doing many of the things that the Federalists had been advocating for years. And with the growing unpopularity of the Federalist Party, particularly after the Hartford Convention of 1814, the Federalist Party was a dying political machine by 1816. The death of the Federalist Party and the adjustments made by the Republican Party led to this period of political stagnation between 1816 and 1824, called the Era of Good Feeling, which basically just describes that this part of the country was ruled by one political party between this era, 1816 through 1824, the Democratic Republicans. And this would remain the case until 1825, when Andrew Jackson is going to found the modern Democratic Party, the Democratic Party that we have today. It did become evident by the early 1820s that American politics could not long continue in this one political party era. New forces were transforming the geographical sections of the North, of the South, and of the West of the country as a series of sharp and bitter conflicts brought out underlining sectional antagonism between these three sections of the country, particularly between the North and the South. So by 1824, the sections had again become defined as they began to defend the stand that they were to take until the Civil War. And we're going to go into more detail about this sectionalism that begins to develop in the next learning objective. So I'll see you there.